Hi, Nick Lapham here, and welcome back to this series covering fuel policy. You might have noticed I've changed the title of the series from EASA fuel policy to just fuel policy in general. And that's because the UK CAA adjusted their regulations in October 25, and it's now largely identical to the EASA policy. Now this is going to be quite a long and detailed lesson, and I've done this so that hopefully I naturally cover a lot of questions that you might have about the policy. And I'll also do so by showing you the actual wording of the regulations so that you don't have to take my word for it. So we'll pick up from where we left off with the last video, looking at the easy access rules for air operations. I've only attached the EASA version here, but a simple Google search of the same title will lead you to the UK version. Now last time we looked at implementing rule CAT OP MPA 181, covering the fundamentals of a fuel energy scheme, and we finished off about halfway through the rule. Now we get on to quite an important subject that will be the focus of a lot of ATPL exam questions. As part of an operator's fuel energy planning and in-flight replanning policy, they are required to ensure that a certain quantity of fuel is on board the aircraft before it is dispatched. This pre-flight calculation of fuel for flight is sometimes referred to as block fuel or ramp fuel. And this is broken up into a number of individual categories, each designated for a particular purpose. So let's go through the list. The first allotment is taxi fuel, or energy. I'm just going to ignore the energy part and say fuel from now on. So taxi fuel must not be less than the amount expected to be used prior to takeoff. Well, that's not very specific, and it's not meant to be. Remember that this is an implementing rule, the broad principle that must be satisfied by all aircraft engaged in commercial air transport, regardless of who the operator is or what the performance class is. So this is where we would refer to the AMCs for guidance on how to satisfy the regulation. So here's our first AMC, and you can see that it says the basic scheme. So if the operator is willing to accept a rigid basic scheme template provided by the authority, then this AMC would provide the required guidance. And you can also see that this covers Performance Class A aircraft. Performance Class B would still need to satisfy the requirements of the implementing rules, but there is another AMC containing a much simpler set of recommendations to meet the standards. Now the AMC says for taxi fuel, this must take into account the local conditions at the departure aerodrome and the APU consumption. So that's quite a bit clearer. But you might find yourself wondering, what does local conditions mean? So this is where we would need guidance material. So local conditions includes NOTAMs, met conditions, ATS procedures, and anticipated delays. So now we're a fair bit clearer about what needs to be considered for taxi fuel. As for the practicalities of exactly how much is added, well, this depends on the aircraft and the operation. So the operator must tell the authority how they intend to plan this fuel. Back to the implementing rule. The next allotment is trip fuel. So this must be an amount added to enable the aircraft to fly from takeoff to landing at the destination. Very broadly, this is the fuel required from runway to runway. So let's go back to AMC 1. So trip fuel must include fuel for takeoff and climb from aerodrome elevation to the initial cruising level and must take into account expected departure routing. Then consider cruise from top of climb to top of descent, and fuel from top of descent to a point from where the approach procedure is initiated, taking into account the expected arrival routing, and fuel for approach and landing. So in summary, trip fuel must take you from runway to runway via the expected routing. Next is contingency fuel, and there's quite a lot to say here. Contingency fuel is to compensate for unforeseen factors. What does that mean? Let's look at the guidance material. So unforeseen factors are those that could have an influence on the fuel consumption to the destination aerodrome, such as deviations of an individual aeroplane from the expected fuel consumption data, deviations from forecast meteorological conditions, extended unexpected delays in flight, extended unexpected taxi times, and deviations from planned routings and/or cruising levels. Now here comes an important bit. Unforeseen factors may differ based on the type of fuel scheme adopted by each operator. The higher the capability of the operator, the fewer unforeseen factors there may be. For example, operators that have a fuel consumption monitoring system should calculate the trip fuel based on the individual fuel consumption. Extended unexpected delays or deviations from forecast meteorological conditions are mitigated by means of statistical data. So what that means is that operators making use of advanced schemes, such as the basic scheme with variations or an individual scheme, are in a good position to anticipate unforeseen factors. So it makes sense for them to be able to reduce the contingency fuel that's carried, whereas an operator using the basic scheme would be expected to carry more. So we need to compensate for unforeseen factors. How do we do that? Well, the first thing to note is the amount of contingency fuel carried depends on the operator's fuel scheme. Now, AMC1 only covers the basic scheme. So if an operator is using the basic scheme, they carry contingency fuel calculated as 5% of the trip fuel. And this must then be compared to an amount to hold for 5 minutes at holding speed at 1500 feet above the destination aerodrome in standard conditions. So whichever is higher of those two amounts, that is the amount of contingency fuel that is carried under the basic scheme. Now there are other options for operators that are using other fuel schemes. So this might get a little bit complicated. In AMC 6, we are now talking about variations that are applied to the basic scheme. So if an operator establishes and maintains a fuel consumption monitoring system for individual aeroplanes and uses valid data for fuel calculations based on that system, then they are reducing the number of uncertainties, and they may use any of the methods that appear in this list. Now, there is an option that says 3% or 20 minutes, or there is a statistical fuel method. The good news for you is that the 20-minute option and the statistical fuel are not examined. So let's try and simplify this picture a little bit. Under the basic scheme with variations, contingency fuel should be whatever is higher between an amount that is not less than 3% of the planned trip fuel and an amount to hold for 5 minutes. Now there is an important caveat here. In order to use the 3%, there must be a suitable en route alternate available, so that the aircraft could divert to it if it became necessary. Now let me be clear, that en route alternate is an entirely different concept to a destination alternate. And in addition, this en route alternate has to be strategically located. Let's look in a bit more depth at where the en route alternate would need to be. Now there's a lot of text here, and I'm going to avoid reading it out, but you can pause the video and review it. Personally, I prefer pictures. So what we have to do in this scenario is to construct a circle, and within that circle, our en route alternate has to be located within it. And the size of the circle and the distance that it is placed backwards from our destination will depend on the total trip distance. So that means you can't just pick any arbitrary airfield en route. It has to be strategically located within this area, and that allows the operator to use 3% contingency. Now there is one final means to reduce contingency fuel, and that is called the reduced contingency fuel procedure. And that's quite an in-depth subject on its own, so it will be addressed in a future video. On to destination alternate fuel. So this is fuel to carry the aircraft from your destination, assuming you weren't able to land, to the destination alternate aerodrome. Now your aerodrome selection policy will dictate what may be used as an alternate, and the regulations will specify rules about how many alternates are required. If we go to AMC 1, we have a clear view of what should be included in alternate fuel. So this will be fuel to cover the aircraft from the decision altitude or minimum descent altitude via the missed approach procedure and then via all expected routing all the way to the alternate. So it's basically a mini version of trip fuel. Typically, at least one alternate is required for all IFR flights. There is an alleviation for operators using the basic scheme with variations, whereby they may plan without a destination alternate, but there must be a high level of assurance that the aircraft would not require an alternate. So this means the trip has to be short, less than 6 hours, there needs to be 2 separate usable runways, and the weather needs to be good. If the operator plans without a destination alternate, they are required to add fuel that would enable the aircraft to hold at 1,500 feet above its destination for 15 minutes. The next category is final reserve fuel. It's important for us to consider within our fuel planning that sometimes plans fail. Weather changes, runways close, traffic delays happen, approaches are missed, and humans make imperfect predictions. The way that we account for this is by carrying a calculated amount of fuel that we don't intend to use, but exists so that it becomes available if absolutely necessary. So in the context of in-flight fuel management policy, the flight crew have a mandate to protect this final reserve from being used before landing. I'll draw on some more guidance material here. The reason we protect the final reserve is to ensure that a safe landing remains possible at any aerodrome when unforeseen circumstances mean that the flight can no longer be completed as originally planned. In other words, final reserve is not fuel to be managed into the plan, it is fuel protected so that when the plan breaks down, the aircraft still has a safe landing option. So the commander should therefore always think first in terms of where can I land safely and can I do so with more than the final reserve remaining. If the commander estimates that the aircraft can no longer land with the final reserve protected, then the situation has moved beyond normal fuel management. At that point, a fuel emergency should be declared and the crew should consider every available landing option, including options that would not normally be part of the original plan. The quantity of final reserve fuel depends on the aircraft's power plant. Regardless of the type, final reserve is based on a flight profile holding at 1,500 feet above aerodrome elevation in standard conditions. The criteria used for this is always the alternate, unless there isn't one. So we base the calculation on holding at our destination alternate elevation and using the estimated landing mass at our destination alternate. For aircraft with reciprocating or piston engines, this is fuel to fly for 45 minutes. Now the policy is slightly confusing here because holding at 1,500 feet above the aerodrome is not a flight profile typically flown by aircraft in this category. Nevertheless, under commercial rules, this is the policy. For turbine engine aeroplanes, so this is not just turbojet, it also includes turboprop aircraft, final reserve is 30 minutes of fuel. Now let's talk about additional fuel. By this point, a lot of the fuel categories that we've discussed are not fuel that we necessarily expect to burn during a normal flight. They are margins of protection. They exist because the aircraft must remain safe even when the operation stops following the original plan. Now, additional fuel fits into this idea. It is required when the standard fuel calculation does not provide enough fuel to cover the most fuel critical failure or abnormal scenario. In other words, if something significant happens at the most limiting point in the flight. So AMC 4 tells us that for the calculation of fuel to cover this fuel critical emergency, we should examine 2 options, an engine failure and a loss of pressurization scenario. Whichever of these would result in the most significant fuel burn, this is what we're going to be basing our planning on. And we're also going to imagine that this fuel critical emergency happens at the worst possible time, or the critical point. So that would be the point along our route at which we are furthest from a potential diversion option. Now the implementing rule tells us we must consider and plan for this event, but we can get a bit more detail from AMC 1. For additional fuel, include an amount of fuel that allows the aeroplane to proceed in the event of an engine failure or loss of pressurization from the most critical point along the route to a fuel en route alternate aerodrome in the relevant aircraft configuration, and hold there for 15 minutes at 1500 feet above the aerodrome elevation in standard conditions, then make an approach and landing. Now I'm going to rewind to the implementing rule to address a critical sentence. This additional fuel or energy is required only if the minimum amount of fuel that is calculated according to points C2 to C5 is not sufficient for such an event. Now that's referring to the fuel categories that we've already covered. So what that's saying is, don't calculate the amount of fuel for this scenario and immediately add it into the fuel plan. Instead, look over all of the fuel in the rest of your fuel plan and ask yourself, if I experienced an engine failure or depressurization at the critical point, would I have enough fuel to safely divert, hold for 15 minutes and land? If the answer is yes, then you don't need any additional fuel. If the answer is no, then you need to add a top-up to your overall fuel allocation to cover this scenario. Extra fuel is the next category. This is the category we use to add in fuel to account for anticipated delays or specific operational constraints. Now, I've explained in a previous video what an anticipated delay is, but let's quickly revisit it. So this is one that can be predicted based on information that is provided by the state of the aerodrome and/or an air traffic service provider before the flight commences. Now, those final few words are worth talking about, because with extra fuel, we are talking about those things that we could know about before the flight commences. So if we know that something will delay us, we have to add it into our plan. Now you might be tempted to say, can't I just use my contingency fuel for that? And the answer is no, because contingency is for unforeseen variations as opposed to anticipated delays. The final category is discretionary fuel. This is fuel added at the discretion of the commander. Now, by discretion, we mean that the commander uses their own judgment, so we are putting aside hard and fast rules and allowing the crew to use their collective experience to assess the viability of the upcoming flight. Sometimes, the crew may foresee factors that could make the initial planned fuel insufficient for the safe conduct of the flight. And if this is the case, the commander may require that more fuel is added. And they are fully empowered to do so. And once that fuel is required, discretionary fuel officially forms part of the minimum pre-flight usable fuel required to safely complete the flight. Guidance material tells us that the commander's discretion is independent and cannot be encouraged or discouraged. Now that means that despite what Hollywood might suggest, operators cannot pressure the commander either to take discretionary fuel or avoid taking it. That being said, commercial operators are businesses, and naturally they want to keep their costs down. Carrying discretionary fuel increases the mass of the aircraft, meaning the aircraft has to work harder and fuel burn increases. If the fuel proves necessary, then that is simply a cost of running a safe commercial operation. However, if every flight carries large amounts of unjustified just-in-case fuel, then this becomes inefficient and bad for business. And that's everything we need to consider for Performance Class A aircraft. Here's a summary slide with each category to consider for the pre-flight calculation of usable fuel. As I mentioned earlier, this final slide shows that Performance Class B aircraft may be able to meet the regulatory requirements using simpler methods. The broader structure of these requirements largely remains the same. And that's it for this video. I hope this was helpful. Thanks for listening.